Japan looks calm from a distance, an elegant arc of islands stitched to the Pacific. But beneath that beauty, the map is alive. The country sits on the edge of the Ring of Fire, and Japan's own catalog lists dozens upon dozens of active volcanoes, 111 of them, as if the ground keeps a quiet inventory of what it can still become. Mount Fuji rises to 3,176 meters sacred in silhouette, yet still a volcano dormant since 1707, but never truly finished. So what does it mean to build temple cities and daily life on land that can move without asking? And why do people keep returning again and again to this trembling edge? Japan's beauty is not an accident of scenery. It is the surface expression of a deep, relentless mechanism, an island arc built where tectonic plates collide, dive, and reshape the seafloor into mountains. Beneath the Japanese islands, two major oceanic plates, the Pacific Plate and the Philippine Sea Plate, are forced downward beneath neighboring plates along multiple trenches. That subduction does not happen gently. In parts of northeast Japan, research describes the Pacific Plate subducting at rates on the order of 8 to 9 centimeters per year, a slow motion in human time, but a powerful conveyor belt in geological time. From above, this engine draws a dramatic outline, a chain of islands curving like a blade. From below, it manufactures three recurring signatures: earthquakes, volcanoes, and hot springs, all connected to the same invisible choreography. As plates descend, they carry water-rich minerals into the mantle. Fluids released at depth help generate magma, and magma seeks pathways upward. The result is not a single volcano, but a nation-scale network of vents, calderas, and geothermal seams, cataloged with clinical precision by Japan's own institutions. In the Japan Meteorological Agency's National Volcano Catalog, the list of active volcanoes reaches 111, a number that feels almost too neat for something so wild until the country proves it can be counted. But geology in Japan is not just an explanation. It is a landscape you can walk through sometimes without realizing the ground underfoot used to be a crater floor. Take Aso in Kyushu, a vast caldera whose dimensions, about 25 kilometers north to south and 18 kilometers east to west, make it one of the great volcanic basins on Earth. Inside that enormous depression, towns, farms, and roads sit where ancient eruptions once emptied the sky. It is the kind of place that breaks the usual human scale, a caldera so large that people can live within it and still feel like they are simply in a valley. Or look to Kagoshima Bay, where the Aira caldera system hosts Sakurajima, one of Japan's most persistently active volcanoes, close enough to a major city that ashfall becomes part of the weekly rhythm. The Smithsonian's volcano program notes that Aira caldera contains the post-caldera Sakurajima volcano, a reminder that caldera is not a final chapter. Sometimes it is a foundation for what comes next. And then there is Mount Fuji, not the loudest volcano, but perhaps the most psychologically powerful. Its summit stands at 3,076 meters, the highest point in Japan, shaped into a near-perfect cone that looks timeless from a distance. Yet Fuji's last confirmed eruption, the Hoei eruption, began in December 1707 and continued into 1708, leaving a historical scar in ash and memory. Modern Tokyo even preserves public explanations of that event, because in Japan, the past is never fully separated from preparedness. Here, the geological engine spills into daily culture through heat. Japan's volcanic geography feeds an immense onsen world travel sources, describe over 27,000 spring sources, and more than 20,000 hot spring facilities across the country. An archipelago where warm water rises as naturally as mountains do. It is comfort born from fracture lines. Warmth that exists because the earth is restless. And that is the paradox. Japan keeps teaching again and again the same forces that threaten also sustain. Subduction builds mountains and renews soil. It also stores stress that releases as earthquakes. Volcanoes create fertile land. They also produce ash and danger zones. Geothermal heat offers healing baths. It also whispers that magma is never far away. So when Japan's coastlines curve into deep bays, when forests climb steep ridges, when steam rises from rocks beside a snowy river, what is being seen is not merely nature. It is a living border between the stable world humans want and the moving world the planet insists on. If the islands were born from collision, then the real question becomes, how does a culture learn to live gracefully on land that is still being made? Japan is often described as a single country, but ecologically it behaves like a vertical library of climates stacked from north to south, from alpine ridgelines to subtropical shorelines. That long arc of islands stretches across latitudes where winter can lock rivers in ice, and far away, the sea can glow turquoise over coral. It is one of the reasons Japan's nature feels cinematic. A traveler can move through completely different worlds without leaving the same flag behind. In the north of Honshu, there is a place that still carries the memory of what much of Japan once looked like before roads, timber plantations, and modern fragmentation rewrote the map. Shirakami Sanchi, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protects one of the largest remaining pristine beach forests in Japan, an unmodified, continuous wilderness of Japanese beach that has become rare elsewhere. It is not a forest designed for visitors. Even the UNESCO description emphasizes its largely wild character, where the beach stands remain densely distributed within the property. In spring and summer, the canopy can feel like a green ceiling. In autumn, the slopes burn gold and copper. In winter, the silence turns heavy as if snow has padded the world from sound. And yet Japan's biodiversity is not only about latitude. It is also about altitude, how quickly the world changes when mountains rise close to the sea. Nowhere shows this more vividly than Yakushima, another UNESCO natural site, an island that compresses an entire climatic gradient into a small footprint. UNESCO highlights Yakushima's mountains rising to nearly 2,000 meters and an outstanding gradient that runs from high peaks down to the coastline. That steep, fast transition creates layers of habitat, cooler and wetter as one climbs each layer, offering different plant communities, different insects, different bird song. Yakushima is also famous for trees that don't feel like trees anymore, more like time made visible. UNESCO notes the island's extraordinary Japanese cedar, including individuals thousands of years old. And one cedar in particular, Jomonsugi, has become almost mythic, with age estimates often given in the thousands of years. It stands as proof that in Japan, old is not a poetic exaggeration. It can be a measurable living thing. Bark roots, rain, and centuries holding each other up. If Shirakami Sanchi feels like an ancient mainland forest, and Yakushima feels like a mountain compressed into an island, then Japan's most extreme biodiversity stories often come from places that are even more isolated, where evolution has had room to improvise. Far out in the Pacific, the Ogasawara Islands, also listed as UNESCO World Heritage, are frequently described as the Galapagos of the Orient, not because they copy the Galapagos, but because isolation creates similar patterns, species diverge, specialize, and become unique. UNESCO notes that the Ogasawara Islands hold more than 440 native vascular plant species, with exceptionally high endemism, reported as high as 70% in woody plants, and that the islands are habitat for more than 100 recorded native land snail species, over 90% endemic to the islands. Those numbers are not just trivia. They are the shape of a long experiment run by nature with the ocean as its laboratory wall. Now, shift south again, back toward the Ryukyu chain, where warmth and humidity build a different kind of abundance. In 2021, UNESCO added Amami Oshima Island Tokunoshima Island, the northern part of Okinawa Island, and Iriomote Island as a natural World Heritage Property, recognizing ecosystems that support rare and endemic species. UNESCO specifically highlights species such as the Amami rabbit, found only on Amami Oshima and Tokunoshima, the flightless Okinawa rail endemic to northern Okinawa, and the Iriomote cat, which inhabits only Iriomote Island. The list reads like a biological secret, kept in subtropical shadow life that exists nowhere else, and therefore can be lost nowhere else either. The Iriomote cat, in particular, reveals the emotional core of island biodiversity. The beauty is fragile because the range is tiny. Conservation summaries commonly describe a population that is very small, on the order of around 100 individuals in some estimates, and restricted to a single island, facing risks such as habitat loss and road accidents. When a species lives on one small piece of land, the future can hinge on something as ordinary as a new road, a stray animal, or a single development plan. In Japan, biodiversity is often not threatened by one dramatic villain, but by many small pressures that add up quietly. And then there is the ocean, the other half of Japan's ecological identity. Around the southern islands, coral reefs create underwater cities of structure and color. Coral heads layered like rooftops, fish flashing like living confetti currents, pulling sunlight into moving patterns on sand. But these reefs are also among the places where climate stress becomes visible fastest. Scientific and conservation reporting across the region has documented coral bleaching and disturbance events tied to warming waters alongside local human pressures. Long-term observations in parts of Okinawa and the southern Ryukyus have discussed the impacts of repeated disturbances and bleaching events, including the widely reported mass bleaching in the late 1990s and the need for continued monitoring. Regional reef assessments also describe how threats can stack ocean warming and acidification at the global scale, with local stressors such as pollution, overfishing, and habitat degradation adding further strain. In other words, the reefs are not only beautiful, they are sensitive instruments, reacting to changes in temperature and chemistry, like a warning system written in living tissue. This is where Japan's ecological story becomes more than a nature montage. It becomes a question of continuity. A pristine beech forest matters because it preserves what is rare. Ancient cedars matter because they embody time. Island endemics matter because they demonstrate how life can branch into uniqueness. Coral reefs matter because they reveal how quickly that uniqueness can be stressed. And through all of it runs a quiet contradiction. Japan's landscapes are shaped by motion, tectonic motion, ocean motion, seasonal motion. Yet its ecosystems often depend on delicate balance. So the next question almost asks itself, who were the first people to read these landscapes correctly? Snow forests, volcanic islands, subtropical jungles. And how did they learn to live inside them without breaking what they depended on. Long before Japan became Japan in the political sense, it was already a test of human adaptation. An archipelago shaped by shifting coastlines, changing climates, and the constant possibility that the land itself could break its silence. Research writing on Japan's deep past often places the arrival of modern humans in the archipelago at around 38,000 years ago, with migrations occurring through multiple routes northwest and south, depending on sea levels and the geography of the time. That is the first essential truth of early Japan. It was never a sealed world. Even at the edge of the ocean, it was connected. Then, the Ice Age loosened its grip. As warming progressed and forests expanded, a new long chapter began what many references describe as the Jomon period, beginning around 13,000 BCE and lasting until roughly 300 BCE. It is often introduced with a simple detail that feels almost too human: pottery, not metal, not palaces. Pottery often chord-marked the Jomon pattern that gave the era its name. For thousands of years, communities across the islands lived through hunting, fishing, gathering, and localized cultivation building, not just survival strategies, but cultural complexity without the familiar blueprint of large-scale agriculture. And this is where Japan's story becomes unexpectedly intimate. The Jomon world was not only movement and migration, it also contained places where life settled long enough to leave a clear imprint. One example is the Sanai Maruyama site in Aomori, an archaeological site described as a major hub settlement attesting to livelihood, large community scale, and diverse rituals and ceremonies. The significance is not merely that people lived there, but that the settlement reflects a shift towards sedentism, a way of life that suggests planning, storage, shared work, and a social rhythm tied to seasons rather than constant relocation. In a land where coastlines could change and earthquakes could redraw the ground, what does it take for humans to decide, this is where life will stay? And what does it mean to build home? Not as a single structure, but as a long relationship with a place. Early Japan's spiritual imagination is harder to measure than its pottery shards, but artifacts still speak, sometimes quietly, sometimes with startling intensity. Among the most evocative are dog, the clay figurines associated with the Jomon period. Museums and reference works describe dog as appearing around the later Jomon era in many regions, often depicting human forms, frequently female-shaped in ways that seem symbolic rather than purely realistic. Their exact purpose remains debated, but major references note that archaeological evidence suggests links to fertility, childbirth, and ceremonial function figurines, found in contexts that imply ritual use rather than household decoration. That matters because it reveals a worldview. Life and survival were not only technical problems. They were mysteries handled through story symbol and ceremony. In a landscape ruled by volcanoes and seasons, it is easy to imagine why early communities might read spirit into water, wind, stone, and flame. Even if the later organized forms of religion would evolve over centuries, the emotional logic is already visible. Nature is not a backdrop. Nature is an active presence that must be respected, negotiated with, and sometimes feared. The Jomon period, stretched across millennia, did not stand still. Over time, networks formed through exchange, shared styles, and shifting technologies, creating regional variations that still belonged to a recognizable cultural world. And then gradually, a different kind of transformation began to arrive. From across the sea, wet rice agriculture, new tools, and new social structures. Explanations of the Yayoi period often frame it as a major shift lasting from roughly the 3rd century BCE into the 1st century CE, marked by agricultural intensification and changes that reshaped settlement patterns, population dynamics, and power. Archaeological research on early rice in Japan has offered increasingly specific timelines. One peer-reviewed synthesis describes radiocarbon dating of charred rice grains in northern Kyushu, pointing to the latter half of the 9th century BCE, aligning with the emergence of Yayoi culture in Japan, suggesting that farming was not a vague sometime long ago, but a definable turning point with measurable evidence. This is where the documentary lens can tighten the moment food production becomes more controllable. Life reorganizes around paddy storage and collective labor. A society that once followed forests and tides begins to engineer landscapes, terracing, irrigating, planning. With that shift comes opportunity, more stable calories, denser communities, but also tension boundaries matter more. Hierarchy becomes easier to build. Conflict becomes easier to sustain. So the question becomes unavoidable when a new way of life arrives. More productive, more demanding. What survives from the old world, and what gets labeled primitive simply because it refuses to vanish. Japan's early human story is not a single line that moves neatly forward. It is layered, and some layers remain distinct, especially in the north. The Ainu, associated strongly with Hokkaido and surrounding regions, are central to the deeper understanding of Japan as more than one cultural origin story. In 2019, Japan enacted a law, the Act promoting measures to achieve a society in which the pride of Ainu people is respected, recognized in official government summaries as an act that recognizes the Ainu as an indigenous people and aims to advance measures comprehensively. The Library of Congress report notes the law was promulgated in April 2019 and became effective in May 2019. The Government of Japan's Ainu policy promotion page also summarizes the Act's enactment and effect in that same time frame. This recognition matters in a documentary not as a checkbox, but as a moral and historical hinge. It forces a clearer framing. Japan's cultural inheritance is not one pure stream. It is a confluence. And for centuries, that confluence involved pressure assimilation policies, the rewriting of identity, and the struggle over land and representation. Modern acknowledgement can be meaningful, but it also raises uncomfortable questions about what was lost, what is still endangered, and what respect means beyond ceremony. And yet, even within the weight of history, there is a human continuity that feels almost defiant. Across Japan, north to south, communities repeatedly learned how to survive in extremes, harsh winters, typhoons, volcanic soil, steep mountains, and seas that could both feed and destroy. The earliest cultures were not naive about nature. They were observant. They built calendars out of seasons. They built meaning out of danger. They built identity out of place. In Japan, the earliest question was never simply, who are we? It was also, where are we standing? And will it still be here tomorrow? When the archipelago itself is in motion, culture becomes something more than tradition. It becomes a technology of resilient songs, rituals, foodways, craft, and memory, all designed to keep life coherent in a world that can shift without warning. So before the story moves into explorers' empires and the accelerating machinery of later history, one last question hangs in the air. How did early Japan transform survival into beauty without forgetting that the ground was never entirely safe? Japan's history does not unfold like a straight road. It moves like the islands themselves, curving, folding, reinventing, and sometimes sealing its doors before opening them again at full speed. The story of development here is never just politics. It is geography turning into power coastlines, turning into trade mountains, turning into borders, and cities turning into symbols. It begins in many ways with the decision to build a center that would outlast storms. In AD 794, Japan's imperial capital was moved to Heian-kyo, the city now known as Kyoto. It was planned with intention laid out on a grid and modeled on great Chinese capitals, an attempt to anchor authority and culture into an ordered map. For centuries, Kyoto served not only as an administrative center, but as a cultural engine court life ritual. Art, architecture, and literature thickened there like layers of lacquer. UNESCO's description of Kyoto emphasizes that it was built in 794 and functioned as the imperial capital until the mid-19th century, meaning the city carried Japan's official heart for more than a millennium. But even as Kyoto held the symbolic center, Japan's coasts were learning a different language, the language of contact. In 1543, Portuguese sailors arrived in Japan, an event Britannica notes as the first European arrival. Their presence did not simply add exotic goods to local markets. It introduced a new kind of pressure, religious missions, foreign trade, and technologies that could reshape warfare. Accounts of the period note how quickly firearms spread and were adopted and refined. The ocean, once mainly a boundary and a resource, became a corridor through which the outside world could push its way into the island's internal politics. Japan's response in the following century was not simple acceptance. It was control. During the early Edo era, the Tokugawa shogunate adopted what is commonly known as sakoku, a policy of national seclusion, implemented through directives in the 1630s restricting overseas travel, limiting foreign trade, and suppressing Christianity. Britannica describes sakoku as a series of directives that enforce self-isolation and tightly controlled foreign contact. This did not mean Japan became blind to the world. It meant the world was filtered, reduced to narrow gateways. One of those gateways became almost mythological in hindsight: Dejima in Nagasaki. Many historical summaries describe Dejima as the Dutch trading post that functioned as a controlled window during the isolation era, placing foreign exchange inside a regulated space knowledge allowed in on Japan's terms under watch. Even the architecture of contact was designed to be containable. And while Japan tightened its external borders, it transformed internally. The Tokugawa period, 1603–1867, is often described as an era of peace and stability under the shogunate conditions that allowed cities to swell and commerce to deepen. In that long, quiet Edo, the city that would become Tokyo grew into something almost unimaginable. Britannica notes that Edo had been Japan's largest city since the 17th century, and other Britannica context suggests Edo may well have become the largest city in the world in the 18th century, passing 1 million people before London and Paris. A wooden city, dense and disciplined, expanding by rules and routines that made an urban civilization possible long before industrial technology arrived. This is the documentary paradox worth lingering on. Japan closed to the world was not static. Inside the borders, the country refined governance, education, commerce craft, traditions, and urban culture. It learned how to run a complex society with astonishing efficiency, like a clock built from timber and paper. clocks can still be forced open. In July 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew C. Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay, with warships demanding that Japan open ports to American ships. The pressure led to the Treaty of Kanagawa, signed March 31st, 1854, a turning point Britannica describes as Japan's first treaty with a Western nation, marking the end of the long seclusion period. Japan did not simply meet the world. It was compelled into a new era where the old control mechanisms could no longer hold. When the doors opened, history accelerated. The Meiji Restoration, dated to 1868, is described by Britannica as a coup d'etat that dissolved Japan's feudal system of government and restored the imperial system. But the deeper meaning was transformation. At scale, institutions, military structures, industry, education, and infrastructure began to change rapidly. The country's leadership pursued modernization with urgency, driven by the awareness that isolation had ended and vulnerability had been exposed. This is where development becomes visible not only in texts, but in steel and smoke. In 2015, UNESCO inscribed the sites of Japan's Meiji Industrial Revolution, iron and steel shipbuilding, and coal mining, a group of component sites that UNESCO describes as bearing testimony to the rapid industrialization of the country from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. This was not a gentle evolution. It was a deliberate build-out of heavy industry coal mines, feeding furnaces, feeding shipyards, feeding national power. In a documentary lens, these sites can be framed as Japan's second landscape, a terrain not carved by glaciers or volcanoes, but by human ambition. Coastal cities and ports became arteries. Mountain coal seams became strategic resources. Factories became cathedrals of a new belief system, progress, speed, capacity. And yet, even as Japan industrialized, Kyoto remained a counterpoint, an older heartbeat that refused to vanish. UNESCO emphasizes Kyoto's role as cultural center while serving as imperial capital for centuries, and the historic monuments that survived wars, fires, earthquakes, and the pressures of modernization. In cinematic terms, Kyoto becomes the scene where time does not move in one direction, it layers. The same country that built furnaces also preserved temples. The same society that pursued industry also continued rituals that treat nature as sacred. The story of Japan's development, then, is not simply from old to new. It is old beside new, often uncomfortably close. A wooden shrine in the shadow of a concrete station. A mountain forest above an industrial bay. A culture that tries to move fast without losing the ability to bow. By the mid-20th century, after devastation and rebuilding Japan produced one of the clearest symbols of its modern identity, the Shinkansen. On October 1st, 1964, just before the Tokyo Olympics, the first Shinkansen service launched between Tokyo and Osaka, often described as the world's first high-speed rail service. It was not merely a train line. It was a statement that Japan could rebuild the idea of a nation through precision timing and engineering. The Embassy of Japan in the UK and multiple historical summaries note that launch date anchoring it as a signature moment when infrastructure became narrative movement turned into meaning. In the documentary arc, this is a perfect closing beat for the historical development section because it links everything that came before. The ordered grid of Kyoto, where planning and cultural refinement became a form of power. The controlled gateway of Dejima, where contact was filtered and knowledge was rationed. The forced opening under Perry, when the outside world cracked the old system. The Meiji era's decision to industrialize at speed, leaving steel fingerprints on the coastline. And finally, a train that made speed itself feel disciplined, almost ceremonial. So the question that rises here is not just historical, it is human. When a country learns to move this quickly, through centuries, through revolutions, through technology, what does it risk leaving behind? And in a land where nature can still interrupt everything with a single tremor, what does progress truly promise? Modern Japan is often filmed as a seamless contrast, a temple lantern glowing beside a convenience store sign, a bullet train slicing past rice fields, a quiet onsen town breathing steam into winter air. But beneath that clean surface, the present day carries pressures that are not aesthetic at all. Pressure from numbers, from weather, from risk, and from the simple fact that Japan's most iconic places are now desired by millions at the same time. Tourism is the most visible wave. Japan welcomed 36.87 million international visitors in 2024, a new annual record, and overseas visitor spending was reported at 8.1 trillion yen that year, also record-setting. Reuters tied much of that surge to the weak yen and strong demand across seasons, including winter travel. Then in early 2025, the pace became even more intense. Reuters reported Japan surpassed 10 million foreign visitors by March 2025, the fastest pace ever driven again by currency conditions and peak travel periods like cherry blossom season. Numbers like that do not stay abstract for long. They become crowded buses in Kyoto. They become packed train platforms in Tokyo. They become a narrow lane in an old neighborhood that can no longer absorb the world's attention without changing shape. Kyoto, a city built for footpaths and seasonal slowness, has been forced to defend itself in ways that feel both practical and heartbreaking. In 2024, reporting described how parts of Kyoto's Gion area moved to restrict tourist access to certain private alleys amid complaints about harassment of geiko, maiko, and disruptive behavior. And the pressure is not only social, it is financial policy too. In late 2025, The Times reported Kyoto sharply raised its accommodation tax, introducing higher tiers, including a top rate of up to 10,000 yen per night for very high-end stays, as one tool to help manage overtourism's burden on city life and services. The same tension shows up at Japan's most symbolic natural landmark, Mount Fuji. Fuji is not just scenery. It is pilgrimage, national identity, and a single silhouette that millions want to stand inside for one photo. But mountains have limits, and so does infrastructure. For the 2025 season, official guidance for Fuji climbers describes a mandatory hiking fee of 4,000 yen, along with required prior reservations, chart registration through an online system. This is not merely a fee. It is a signal that Japan's most famous places are now being treated like fragile systems that must be paced, funded, protected, and in some cases restricted if they are to survive the very attention that made them famous. And yet tourism is only one side of the modern struggle. Another is climate and Japan's relationship with seasons, which has always been cultural as much as it is meteorological. Cherry blossoms are not just flowers, they are timing memory and the ritual of gathering under something temporary. Long-run data analysis shows a clear trend. In Kyoto Peak, blossom timing has shifted earlier, over the long term, consistent with warmer spring temperatures and the combined influence of climate change and urban warming. When a season arrives early, it does not only affect tourism calendars, it alters the emotional architecture of a culture that measures time through natural cues. First blooms, first snowfall, first cicadas, first autumn wind. So, the question becomes, in a land of 4 seasons, what happens when the seasons change their own rules? And then there is the reality Japan never forgets for long disaster risk. Japan's preparedness culture is not performative. It is built from experience. The Japan Meteorological Agency's Earthquake Early Warning (EEW) system is designed to issue alerts just as an earthquake begins, sometimes providing only seconds. But those seconds can be the difference between standing and falling, between stopping a train and letting it run. JMA notes the public EEW service began in October 2007, distributed through media such as TV and radio. And behind the technology sits an institutional framework. Japan's disaster governance is anchored in the Basic Act on Disaster Management, which sets principles, responsibilities, and planning structures across national and local levels. The weight of that framework is easier to understand when the mind returns to March 11, 2011, the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, followed by the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Official government reconstruction summaries refer to roughly 20,000 lives lost in the combined catastrophe, and major reference works describe an official count of confirmed dead or missing of about 18,500. Modern Japan lives with that memory in more than museums. It lives in seawalls and evacuation signs. It lives in school drills. It lives in the way coastal towns rebuild with an awareness that the ocean can be both livelihood and threat. It lives in the quiet seriousness with which warnings are taken, because there is no fantasy of perfect safety, here only the discipline of reducing harm. So modern Japan becomes a balancing act on multiple fronts at once. Welcoming the world without letting the world erode what it came to admire. Protecting sacred landscapes without turning them into gated exhibits. Adapting to climate shifts without losing the seasonal rhythms that shape identity. Preparing for disasters without letting vigilance become fear. And in that balance, one final question lingers quietly but insistently. What does resilience cost, and who pays it first? The residents who live there, or the places themselves? Japan is often introduced through its contrasts, ancient wood and neon light mountain solitude and urban speed. But after following the deeper thread, the contrasts begin to feel less like a travel cliché and more like a survival strategy. This is a country built on motion. The islands exist because plates collide and subduct. Mountains rise because the earth insists on reshaping them. Hot springs warm the skin because fractures run deep below. The same forces that create Japan's beauty can also unmake it through ash earthquakes and waves that arrive without mercy. And yet people stayed. They learned the seasons read coastlines and turned danger into knowledge. Early cultures left pottery settlements and ritual artifacts that still whisper of a world view where nature was never background. It was presence, powerful enough to demand respect. History accelerated, slowed, then accelerated again. Capitals were built with geometry and ceremony. Doors were closed to control outside pressure, then forced open by the hard reality of global power. Industry rose along the coasts. Rail lines became arteries. And by 1964, the first Shinkansen line launched as a symbol of a nation that decided speed could be disciplined precision as identity. Now, in the modern era, Japan faces another kind of collision, less geological, more human. Record-breaking tourism surges bring prosperity and strain at the same time. Cities like Kyoto push back to protect daily life. Mount Fuji adds systems to prevent its own symbolism from being loved to death. Climate shifts tug at the timing of seasons that once felt dependable. And disaster preparedness remains a quiet baseline because memory here is practical, not abstract. So if this journey leaves one message, it is not simply Japan is beautiful. It is this beauty can be a responsibility. To travel here on the world's edge is to enter a living system. Respect the places that hold silence. Follow local rules even when they complicate convenience. Choose smaller towns and off-peak seasons when possible. Support cultural spaces that are run by communities, not just marketed at them. And when the mountain asks for limits, or the city asks for distance, understand that these boundaries are not rejection, they are preservation. Because on the map, the edge of the world looks like a line. But in Japan, the edge is a rhythm, still moving, still breathing. And the question that remains is simple: what will be left after everyone has visited?